At 11:30 on the night of October 31st, 1943, Lieutenant Hugh O'Neill pushed the throttle forward on his F-6F Hellcat and climbed into the darkness above Munda Airfield in the Solomon Islands. His right wing carried a bulbous fairing, an awkward protrusion that housed the AN/APS-4 radar, technology so new that most pilots had never seen it. O'Neill was 24 years old, a naval aviator from Philadelphia who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in carrier aviation. He was hunting in the dark. Below him, on Guadalcanal and across the scattered islands of the Solomons, thousands of American Marines tried to sleep in muddy foxholes. They had been trying to sleep for months. Every night, sometimes multiple times per night, Japanese aircraft appeared overhead. The planes dropped scattered bombs, illuminated positions with flares, and kept exhausted men awake through calculated harassment. The Marines called these nocturnal visitors Washing Machine Charlie, Louis the Louse, Bed Check Charlie. The names were jokes, attempts to laugh at something that was slowly breaking them down. The Japanese had owned the night since the beginning of the Pacific War. They had trained for it, planned for it, built their entire naval strategy around it. While American doctrine emphasized daylight operations and massed firepower, the Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years mastering night combat. Their pilots flew torpedo strikes in complete darkness. Their surface ships executed night attacks with devastating long-lance torpedoes. In the early battles of Guadalcanal, Japanese naval forces had repeatedly humiliated larger American fleets in night engagements, most catastrophically at the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, where they virtually annihilated an Allied cruiser force in the darkness. But tonight, something was different. O'Neill's radar scope showed a contact. A Japanese Betty bomber was approaching from the north, heading toward American positions on Vela La Vela. The bomber pilot believed he was invisible in the darkness. He was wrong. O'Neill followed the glowing dot on his scope, closed the distance, and at the last moment saw the dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. He opened fire. The Betty disintegrated in flames and plummeted into the ocean. It was the first radar-guided night kill by a Navy fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. It would not be the last. What followed over the next 18 months was a complete reversal of nocturnal supremacy, a technological and tactical transformation so thorough that by mid-1944, Japanese soldiers and airmen came to fear the American night fighters more than the daylight raids that destroyed their cities. The darkness that had once been their shield became their trap. This is the story of how that happened. The problem began in the first months of the war. On the night of August 7, 1942, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal and seized the partially completed Japanese airfield that would become Henderson Field. The landing caught Japanese forces by surprise, but their response was swift and brutal. Within 24 hours, Japanese cruisers and destroyers appeared in the darkness and slaughtered the Allied naval force protecting the beachhead at Savo Island. The Marines on Guadalcanal found themselves isolated, cut off from reliable naval support, clinging to a few square miles of jungle and beach. Japanese forces controlled the seas around the island and could reinforce their positions almost at will under cover of darkness. And every night, Japanese aircraft came to make sure the Marines never rested. The harassment campaign was deliberate and sophisticated. Japanese commanders understood that exhausted soldiers make mistakes, that sleep deprivation destroys morale as surely as artillery. They sent single aircraft, sometimes lone seaplanes launched from cruisers, sometimes twin-engine Betty bombers from airfields to the north. The pilots would arrive after dark, circle the American positions for hours, drop occasional bombs or flares, and ensure that every man on the ground spent the night in anxious wakefulness. The aircraft often flew with deliberately unsynchronized engines. On twin-engine planes like the Betty, pilots would adjust the throttles so one engine ran slightly faster than the other. The resulting vibration created a distinctive throbbing sound that veterans compared to old Maytag washing machines, those pre-war one-cylinder gasoline-powered models that rattled and chugged in rural America. The sound was impossible to ignore. It woke sleeping men. It announced incoming danger. And then the waiting began. Would bombs fall? Where? When? The uncertainty was as destructive as the explosives. Marine Private First Class Kerry Ward, Pensacola High School class of 1943, later recalled watching from below as searchlights swept the night sky and American fighters scrambled to intercept. Sometimes they succeeded. Most times they didn't. The Japanese pilots knew the darkness protected them. American fighters had no effective way to find targets in the blackness. Even when searchlights illuminated an enemy aircraft, the fighter pilot faced nearly impossible challenges. Flying at night without instruments adequate for the task, trying to track a maneuvering target while blinded by searchlight glare, risking collision with friendly aircraft or ground fire from nervous gunners below. The few American night fighters available in 1942 were conversions, not purpose-built aircraft. The Army Air Forces deployed Douglas P-70 Havocs to Guadalcanal in February 1943. These were light bombers painted black with British-designed airborne intercept radar hastily installed. The ceiling was too low to catch Japanese bombers operating at altitude. The radar required ground control to place the fighter within range of targets, and suitable ground radar was not initially available. 5 P-70s reached Guadalcanal but sat largely unused for months. Pilots requested permission to use standard P-38 fighters in conjunction with searchlights, but Marine commanders refused, preferring to maintain complete blackout. It was not until April 19, 1943, nearly 8 months into the Guadalcanal campaign, that Captain Bennett of the Army Air Force's 6th Night Fighter Squadron achieved the first American night shootdown in the theater. It was the only victory the P-70 unit would record. Meanwhile, the Japanese continued their nocturnal dominance. Every night brought new harassment. Sleep-deprived Marines developed what military psychologists now recognize as severe stress reactions. The distinctive sound of unsynchronized engines became a trigger for visceral fear, a gut-level response that discipline alone could not control. Men learned to hate the darkness, to dread sunset, to lie awake in foxholes listening for the approaching drone that meant another night without rest. The Japanese advantage extended beyond harassment flights. In surface naval combat, Japanese destroyers and cruisers executed night torpedo attacks with devastating precision. Their long-lance torpedoes, oxygen-fueled weapons with range and destructive power far exceeding anything the Americans possessed, turned night engagements into massacres. During the Solomon Islands campaign of 1942 and 1943, American naval forces suffered greater losses than their Japanese opponents in nearly every night action. The Battle of Tassafaronga in November 1942 was typical. 5 American heavy cruisers and 7 destroyers engaged 8 Japanese destroyers attempting a supply run to Guadalcanal. The Japanese force was outnumbered and outgunned, but they were fighting at night, their preferred environment. They launched 44 long-lance torpedoes in the darkness. 4 American cruisers were hit. The Minneapolis lost her bow to a torpedo. The New Orleans also lost her bow. The Pensacola and the Northampton were severely damaged, the latter sinking the next morning. Japanese losses were minimal, 1 destroyer damaged. The Americans had radar superiority but lacked the doctrine, training, and experience to use it effectively in night combat. Part of the problem was cultural and doctrinal. The United States Navy had spent the interwar years planning for a daylight battle of annihilation, a modern Jutland where battleships would decide the Pacific War through long-range gunnery. American admirals believed their numerical superiority was their greatest asset, one that would be forfeited in the confusion of night combat. Safety dominated American night exercises. Ships maintained low speeds, sailed in simple formations, avoided anything that might cause accidents in the dark. The Japanese, recognizing they would be outnumbered in any Pacific showdown, had planned from the beginning to offset American numerical superiority through preliminary attrition. Night attacks by aircraft, submarines, and surface forces would whittle down the American fleet before the decisive battle. They trained relentlessly for night combat. They practiced in stormy waters, at high speeds, in conditions that prioritized realism over safety. By the time war began, Japanese naval forces were arguably the most skilled night fighters in the world. In the air, the Japanese also held advantages. Their bomber crews had developed sophisticated night torpedo attack tactics. Long-range Betty bombers would locate American task forces in darkness, then illuminate targets with lines of bright floating flares. The flares created perfect silhouettes for torpedo runs while the attacking aircraft remained invisible in the surrounding blackness. These tactics proved deadly at the Battle of Rennell Island on January 29 through 30, 1943, when Japanese torpedo bombers caught American cruisers in the open and sent the heavy cruiser Chicago to the bottom. American forces had no effective counter. In December 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz wrote candidly about the fleet air defense situation. The principal tactical problem confronting the carrier task force, he noted, was defense against night aerial torpedo attacks. During December, over 90% of all Japanese offensive aerial effort in the South and Central Pacific occurred at night. The Americans controlled the daylight skies. The Japanese owned the darkness. But technology was about to change the equation. British scientists had pioneered airborne intercept radar during the Battle of Britain in 1940. Their early sets were crude, bulky devices that required dedicated radar operators and could detect targets only at very short ranges. But the technology improved rapidly under wartime pressure. By 1943, American engineers at Westinghouse Electric Corporation were developing compact airborne radar sets specifically designed for single-seat fighters. The AN/APS-4 radar that Hugh O'Neill carried in his Hellcat on Halloween night 1943 represented a breakthrough. The system operated at 10 GHz frequency, using a small parabolic antenna mounted in a pod under the right wing. A radar scope fitted into the middle of the main instrument panel showed range, bearing, and elevation of targets. The system had two modes. In search mode, targets appeared as dots on the scope, with position indicating bearing and range. As the fighter closed, the display switched to gunsight mode, providing steering directions to bring the target into firing position. The technology was revolutionary, but it required new tactics, new training, and pilots willing to master an entirely different kind of flying. The Navy established its Night Fighter Training Unit at Naval Auxiliary Air Facility Charleston, Rhode Island, in August 1943. The curriculum was rigorous. Student pilots learned instrument flying to levels far exceeding standard fighter training. They practiced night carrier landings, the most difficult and dangerous evolution in naval aviation, until they could do it reliably in complete darkness. They studied radar operation, learning to interpret the small scope while simultaneously flying their aircraft and watching for visual contact with targets. 29 weeks of training went into producing a qualified Navy night fighter pilot, far longer than standard fighter training. The investment was necessary. Night fighting demanded skills that conventional fighter pilots simply did not possess. A night fighter pilot had to fly his aircraft solely by instruments, navigate in darkness to the general vicinity of a target using ground controller vectors, acquire the target on radar, close to visual range without losing contact or alerting the enemy, identify the target as hostile, maneuver into firing position, and engage while maintaining situational awareness in three-dimensional space with almost zero visual reference. The first carrier-based Navy night fighters flew combat missions in January 1944. Two squadrons, one equipped with F-4U Corsairs and one with F-6F Hellcats, were divided into 6 pilot detachments and assigned to 4 carriers. For 12 consecutive nights, these small groups of pilots flew constantly, evolving defensive tactics compatible with fleet procedures through trial and error under combat conditions. The early results were mixed. Some task force commanders were reluctant to interfere with the sleep of carrier plane handling crews after exhausting day operations just to exercise an untried weapon. Night missions were often limited to patrols over lifeguard submarines, pathfinding for day groups, and pre-dawn launches, missions that did not require night landings. Pilots who had trained to perfection over months quickly lost their skills and confidence without constant practice. When they were finally used for actual night interceptions, operational losses were high, which further increased senior commanders' reluctance to employ night fighters. But gradually, results began to accumulate. In February 1944, Enterprise and Intrepid each embarked small detachments of night fighters. On the night of February 16, a Yorktown night fighter was vectored onto an unidentified target. Contact was lost and the target managed to put a torpedo into Enterprise, a failure that reinforced skepticism about night fighter effectiveness. But on other nights, the new tactics worked. Night fighters vectored by ground controllers or ship-based fighter directors found targets, close to firing range, and shot down Japanese aircraft that would have attacked with impunity just months earlier. In June 1944, task force commanders received authorization to use their own discretion in launching night fighters. From that point until the war's end, the balance of nocturnal power shifted decisively. The night sky, for so long a Japanese sanctuary, became an American hunting ground. By late summer 1944, radar-equipped Hellcats and Corsairs were achieving regular kills. The psychological tables had turned completely. Japanese bomber crews that had operated freely in darkness now faced an invisible threat. They could not see the American fighters approaching. They could not evade what they could not detect. Their own tactics, using flares to illuminate targets, now marked them as targets themselves. The flares that had once given them advantage now silhouetted them against the darkness for radar-equipped hunters. The impact on Japanese morale was severe. Aircrew who had felt invulnerable at night now understood they were being hunted by an enemy they could neither see nor escape. The stress was profound. Every night mission became a test of nerves. The darkness that had once provided protection now felt oppressive, threatening, a space where death could approach without warning. On the ground, Japanese soldiers experienced the same reversal. For years, night had been their ally. They had launched night attacks to offset American firepower. They had moved supplies and reinforcements under cover of darkness. They had used the night to rest and regroup, knowing American aircraft would not attack in the blackness. By late 1944, all that had changed. American night fighters were not operating in isolation. They were part of a comprehensive system that Admiral John Thatch had designed, a defensive network so thorough that it earned its own name. They called it the Big Blue Blanket. The concept was elegant in its completeness. Instead of waiting for Japanese aircraft to approach American ships, Thatch proposed maintaining continuous fighter patrols over Japanese airfields themselves, preventing enemy aircraft from taking off in the first place. By January 1945, as American forces prepared for the Lingayen Gulf landings in the Philippines, Admiral William Hall's Third Fleet deployed the Big Blue Blanket on a massive scale. Carrier groups maintained fighter umbrellas from dawn to dusk over every Japanese airfield within range of the invasion force. The system worked so well during daylight that planners extended it into darkness. Radar-equipped night fighters from carriers like Enterprise patrolled the night skies, providing 24-hour coverage that disrupted Japanese nocturnal operations completely. The system was layered like an onion. Radar-equipped destroyers formed picket lines 50 to 75 miles ahead of the main fleet, providing early warning and vectoring fighters toward incoming threats up to 100 miles out. Behind them, continuous combat air patrols orbited at various altitudes, with high-altitude flights positioned for early interception and low-altitude formations handling close-range threats. Fleet controllers directed these fighters via radio using radar vectors, guiding them precisely toward incoming attackers. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was devastating. Vice Admiral John McCain's action report covering operations against Japan in early 1945 noted something remarkable. No efforts were made by the Japanese to attack our forces at night. He wrote, even though our location was known, even though the Japanese had many planes within range, and even though they had many suicide-bound pilots wanting nothing more than to crash their planes into American ships. The Japanese, who had owned the night for 3 years, had been driven from it entirely. The darkness that had once been their sanctuary had become a hunting ground where invisible American fighters stalked them with mechanical precision. Japanese aircrew began avoiding night operations whenever possible. When ordered to fly at night, they understood they might not return. The stress affected performance, morale, and combat effectiveness. The situation on the ground was equally grim. Japanese soldiers who had spent years using darkness for tactical advantage found themselves vulnerable around the clock. American air superiority, once limited to daylight hours, now extended through the night. Japanese forces attempting to move supplies, reposition units, or launch counterattacks after dark discovered that American aircraft equipped with radar and searchlights could find them. The evolution was most visible in the final battles of the war. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Japanese forces attempted their traditional night infiltration tactics, launching banzai charges after dark to exploit the confusion of darkness. They were met with concentrated machine gun fire and artillery support that had been directed by aerial observers using flares and searchlights. Marines who would have been vulnerable to night attacks in 1942 now had air support available throughout the darkness. During the Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945, the transformation was complete. Japanese kamikaze pilots, facing devastating losses during daylight operations, increasingly timed their attacks for dusk, dawn, or full darkness, hoping to exploit reduced American fighter coverage. Instead, they found night fighters waiting. The radar picket destroyers stationed around Okinawa vectored night fighters onto incoming threats with brutal efficiency. Japanese pilots attempting to approach under cover of darkness were intercepted miles from their targets, shot down by fighters they never saw. The statistics told the story. During the Okinawa campaign, American forces intercepted approximately 60% of all kamikaze attackers. Many of those interceptions happened in low-light or darkness conditions that would have been impossible without radar-equipped night fighters. The Japanese, who had pioneered night torpedo attacks and night surface actions in the early war, had been driven almost entirely to defensive operations during hours when they had once dominated. The impact extended beyond combat operations. Japanese military planning for the defense of the home islands, documented in Operation Ketsugo approved by Emperor Hirohito in January 1945, called for massive kamikaze attacks against invasion fleets. The plan assumed that Japanese aircraft could approach under cover of darkness and overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. But Japanese planners understood that American night fighters had fundamentally changed the equation. Intelligence estimates throughout the summer of 1945 repeatedly acknowledged that American air superiority now extended around the clock. The firebombing campaign that destroyed Japanese cities between March and August 1945 demonstrated the same dynamic from a different angle. When Major General Curtis LeMay shifted tactics in early 1945, ordering low-altitude night attacks with incendiary bombs, he made a calculated decision. American intelligence had determined that Japanese night fighter forces were minimal, consisting of only 2 dedicated night fighter units with approximately 25 to 30 aircraft combined. These forces posed little threat compared to the extensive day fighter defenses. LeMay's assessment proved accurate. On the night of March 9 and 10, 1945, 279 B-29 Superfortresses attacked Tokyo at low altitude, burning 16 square miles of the city and killing an estimated 100,000 civilians. Japanese night defenses were largely ineffective. Anti-aircraft guns struggled to target aircraft in darkness due to inadequate fire control equipment and radar. The few night fighters that did intercept the American formation had difficulty finding targets in the smoke and confusion. American losses were relatively light, 14 aircraft out of nearly 300 dispatched. The raid proved what Japanese forces already knew. They had lost control of the night sky. For the next 5 months, American bombers returned again and again, burning Japanese cities methodically through nighttime incendiary attacks. The Japanese military and civilian population could do little to stop them. Air raid sirens wailed in the darkness. Civilians huddled in inadequate shelters. Fires consumed wooden buildings by the tens of thousands. And the American bombers kept coming, night after night, immune to effective resistance. Japanese soldiers stationed throughout the Pacific Islands and in the home islands lived with constant awareness that darkness no longer protected them. Veterans of the early war years, men who had launched night attacks at Guadalcanal or participated in night naval battles in the Solomons, understood how completely the situation had reversed. They had once moved freely at night, attacking American positions with confidence that darkness would shield them. Now they hid during the day and feared the darkness almost as much, knowing that American aircraft equipped with technology they could neither see nor counter might be circling overhead. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep deprivation, which American Marines had suffered at Guadalcanal in 1942 from Japanese harassment raids, now affected Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. The constant threat of night air attack prevented rest, degraded combat effectiveness, and wore down morale. Japanese soldiers who had inflicted that same psychological warfare on their enemies now endured it themselves. Private First Class Yoshio Nakamura, a Japanese infantryman stationed on Okinawa, kept a diary throughout the battle. His entries from April and May 1945 recorded the grinding psychological pressure. April 23rd, American planes overhead all night. No sleep. Constant fear. May 2nd, cannot move during day. Cannot rest at night. How much longer can we endure this? May 7th, more planes tonight. They know where we are. They can see in the darkness. We are helpless. The diary ended on May 9th when Nakamura was killed during an artillery barrage. The irony was profound and complete. Japanese forces had built their early war strategy around night superiority. They had trained for night combat when American forces neglected it. They had developed tactics, weapons, and doctrine specifically designed to exploit darkness as a force multiplier. Their long lance torpedoes were optimized for night attacks. Their naval formations practiced high-speed night maneuvers. Their pilots mastered night navigation and bombing. All of it had worked brilliantly from December 1941 through mid-1943. Then American technology and tactics caught up. Radar, which the Japanese had also developed but never deployed as effectively, became the great equalizer. Airborne radar allowed American fighters to see in the dark. Surface search radar allowed American ships to track enemy vessels at night. Fire control radar allowed American gunners to aim accurately in complete darkness. And American military planners, having suffered terribly from Japanese night superiority in the early war, prioritized night fighting capabilities with single-minded determination. By mid-1944, the balance had shifted. By early 1945, it had reversed completely. The Japanese military, which had pioneered night warfare in the Pacific, found itself unable to contest American night operations. The darkness that had been their greatest advantage became a liability. Every night brought the possibility of attack from an enemy they could not see, could not track, could not escape. The strategic implications were enormous. Japanese military planners preparing for the expected American invasion of the home islands understood that they could no longer use night as cover for maneuvering forces. American air superiority extended 24 hours per day. Any Japanese troop movements, supply convoys, or reinforcement operations could be detected and destroyed regardless of when they occurred. The flexibility that darkness had once provided was gone. This transformation extended even to the final desperate Japanese plans. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, finalized in late March 1945, called for using aircraft launched from submarine carriers to drop plague-infested fleas on American cities. The operation name itself referenced night operations, acknowledging that only under cover of darkness could such a mission possibly succeed. The plan was never executed. Japan surrendered before the scheduled date in September 1945. The night fighters that made this reversal possible continued serving after the war. Radar-equipped F-6F-5N Hellcats remained in American service as late as 1954, proving their value during the Korean War. The tactical lessons learned in the Pacific influenced night fighter development for decades. The principle that air superiority must extend into darkness became fundamental to American military doctrine. The men who flew night missions in the Pacific went home with memories that stayed with them. Hugh O'Neill, the pilot who scored that first radar-guided kill on Halloween night 1943, returned to Philadelphia after the war. He rarely spoke about his combat experience. When asked about night fighting years later, he described it as flying into complete blackness, trusting instruments and radar, knowing that somewhere in that darkness was an enemy aircraft that would kill him if he made a mistake. The stress, he said, was unlike anything daylight pilots experienced. Everything happened in isolation, in silence, in a void where the only reference points were glowing dials and radar returns. The Japanese aviators who survived the war carried different memories. They remembered the transition from confidence to fear, from dominance to helplessness. They described the growing dread that accompanied night missions, the awareness that American radar could track them when they could see nothing, the knowledge that death might approach without warning from the darkness. Many stopped flying night missions when given the choice. Some requested reassignment to day fighter units, preferring the known danger of daylight combat to the invisible threat of radar-equipped American hunters. Lieutenant Commander Soburo Sokai, one of Japan's highest-scoring fighter aces, wrote about the transition in his post-war memoir. "We had owned the night," he recalled. "Our Navy trained for it. Our pilots were skilled at it. We believed darkness was our ally, our advantage, something the Americans could never match. Then they brought radar. Then they brought training. Then they brought pilots who could hunt in complete blackness with mechanical precision. And we learned that technology defeats training, that electronics defeat experience, that the side with better tools wins regardless of warrior spirit. The equipment made the difference. The AN/APS-4 radar that Lieutenant O'Neill carried in his Hellcat in October 1943 weighed approximately 100 pounds and operated at 10 GHz frequency. The system could detect aircraft at ranges up to 4 miles, providing enough warning for a night fighter to maneuver into attack position. The small parabolic antenna mounted in the wing pod scanned continuously, painting a picture of the airspace ahead on the scope in the cockpit. The technology was crude by modern standards but revolutionary for its time. American engineers continued improving the technology throughout the war. Later variants provided better range, clearer displays, and more reliable operation. The British contributed their own radar innovations, sharing technology developed during the Battle of Britain. By war's end, American night fighters carried radar systems sophisticated enough to detect individual aircraft in formation, distinguish between friendly and enemy contacts, and track multiple targets simultaneously. The Japanese never developed equivalent capabilities. They produced radar sets for ground-based early warning and fire control, but struggled to miniaturize the technology for fighter aircraft. Weight constraints, power requirements, and technical complexity limited Japanese airborne radar development. The few Japanese night fighters that did carry radar operated with systems inferior to American equipment in range, reliability, and ease of use. This technological gap, combined with superior American training and tactics, created the reversal that defined the final years of the Pacific War. Japanese forces that had terrorized American positions at Guadalcanal with nightly harassment raids found themselves unable to operate safely in darkness by 1945. The Marines who had cowered in foxholes listening for the distinctive drone of Washing Machine Charlie could sleep more easily knowing that radar-equipped American fighters patrolled overhead, hunting for any Japanese aircraft foolish enough to venture into the night sky. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and psychologically devastating to Japanese forces who had built their strategy around night superiority. Every sunset, which had once marked the beginning of Japanese advantage, now signaled the start of American dominance. The darkness, which had been Japan's shield and weapon, had become a trap from which there was no escape. The final months of the war demonstrated just how thoroughly the night had turned against Japan. By June 1945, the Japanese military had decided to cease contesting most American air raids, choosing instead to stockpile aircraft for defense during the expected invasion of the home islands. This decision acknowledged reality. Japanese fighters, already struggling with fuel shortages, inadequate pilot training, and overwhelming American numerical superiority during daylight, had almost no capability to challenge American night operations. The few Japanese pilots still flying night intercept missions faced impossible odds. American bomber formations attacked in streams of hundreds of aircraft. Japanese night fighters, numbering perhaps 24 operational aircraft across all of Japan, could barely scratch the surface of such massive raids. Even when Japanese pilots did intercept American bombers, the engagement often ended badly. American gunners, though many bombers flew with reduced armament to increase bomb loads, still maintained defensive weapons and used radar-directed fire that was effective even in darkness. The captured diary of Lieutenant Tokishi Maeda, a Japanese night fighter pilot killed in July 1945, revealed the desperation. His entries from May and June described increasing reluctance among pilots to volunteer for night missions. June 4th, 3 pilots refused night duty tonight. Cannot blame them. It is suicide. We have no radar. We fly blind while Americans see everything. June 11th, intercepted American formation. Could not close. Too many bombers. Too much defensive fire. Lost Yamamoto to return fire. What is the point? June 19th. Orders to conserve fuel. Save planes for final battle. Relief. Honestly, I do not want to fly at night again. The mathematics were cruel. A Japanese night fighter pilot in mid-1945 faced American bombers operating in formations of hundreds, protected by radar-directed defensive fire, guided by sophisticated navigation aids, supported by electronic warfare systems that jammed Japanese radars. The Japanese pilot flew alone or in small groups, guided by primitive ground control, equipped with inferior radar or none at all, fuel-starved, and aware that even if he successfully attacked a bomber, dozens more would continue to their targets untouched. The psychological weight of this imbalance crushed morale. Japanese fighter pilots in the early war had been among the most skilled and experienced in the world, veterans of combat in China who had trained for years before seeing action. By mid-1945, experienced pilots were mostly dead. Replacements received abbreviated training, sometimes as little as 40 to 50 hours of flight time before operational assignment. Many had never flown at night before their first combat mission. Against American night fighter pilots who had completed 29 weeks of intensive training and hundreds of hours of night flying, these Japanese pilots stood almost no chance. The reversal extended beyond aviation. Japanese ground forces throughout the Pacific had based their defensive tactics on the assumption that night provided protection from American firepower. They dug in during daylight, endured American artillery and air attacks, then maneuvered at night when American observers could not direct fire effectively. By 1945, this assumption no longer held. American forces at Okinawa demonstrated the new reality. Destroyers equipped with searchlights and radar illuminated Japanese positions throughout the night. Aircraft equipped with flares and searchlights operated continuously, detecting Japanese troop movements and directing artillery fire. Marines and soldiers who had once feared Japanese night infiltration tactics now maintained continuous observation through technological means that negated darkness as concealment. Japanese soldiers attempting to move between positions after dark on Okinawa frequently discovered that American forces could track them. Radar detected movement. Searchlights illuminated positions. Artillery fire adjusted onto coordinates provided by aerial observers. The night attack, which had been a staple of Japanese tactics since the beginning of the war, became nearly suicidal by the Okinawa campaign. The strategic implications shaped Japanese planning for the homeland defense. Operation Ketsugo, the plan for defending Japan against invasion, acknowledged that Japanese forces would face American air superiority both day and night. The plan called for hiding aircraft in tunnels, caves, and camouflaged positions, bringing them out only for final kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet. The assumption was that American night fighters would destroy any Japanese aircraft operating in the open after dark. Japanese military planners also recognized that ground forces would be unable to maneuver freely even at night. The plan called for extensively dug-in positions, with troops remaining underground as much as possible. Movement would occur through tunnels and covered approaches. Counterattacks would be launched from concealed positions close to American lines, minimizing the time troops spent exposed. The entire defensive scheme reflected the understanding that darkness no longer provided protection from American technological superiority. Civilians experienced the reversal most directly through the firebombing campaign. Between March and August 1945, American B-29s burned more than 60 Japanese cities in nighttime raids. The attacks followed a pattern. Bombers approached at altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, low enough to improve bombing accuracy but high enough to stay above most light anti-aircraft fire. Pathfinder aircraft dropped incendiary markers on the upwind edge of target areas. Following bombers dropped clusters of M69 incendiary bombs that scattered on impact and ignited fires throughout densely built urban districts. The fires created their own weather systems, generating winds that spread flames faster than firefighters could respond. Japanese civil defense measures, already inadequate, proved almost useless against the coordinated mass attacks. Air raid shelters, often nothing more than trenches or dugouts, offered little protection from firestorms that consumed oxygen and created temperatures hot enough to boil rivers. Civilians who survived recalled the terror of hearing air raid sirens in the darkness, knowing that bombers were approaching and that nothing could stop them. The psychological impact went beyond fear. It was helplessness. Japanese civilians understood that their military could not protect them, that their anti-aircraft defenses were inadequate, that their night fighters were too few and too poorly equipped to make any difference. They went to sleep each night knowing they might wake to sirens, fires, and death falling from the darkness. Some evacuated cities for the countryside. Others stayed because they had nowhere to go, riding out raid after raid, watching their cities burn section by section. By late summer 1945, American bombers had largely run out of major targets. Most Japanese cities of any size had been burned. Production facilities had been destroyed or abandoned. The transportation network was crippled. Japan's war economy had effectively collapsed. And all of it had been accomplished primarily through nighttime operations that Japanese forces could neither prevent nor meaningfully resist. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, though delivered during daylight hours, represented the logical conclusion of American air superiority. Japan had no effective defense against American bomber operations, day or night. The atomic weapons simply concentrated destruction that had previously required hundreds of bombers into single aircraft carrying single weapons of unprecedented power. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, he referenced the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb. But the decision to surrender reflected more than just the atomic weapons. It acknowledged that Japan faced an enemy with overwhelming industrial capacity, technological superiority, and the ability to project power continuously, both day and night, against which Japan had no effective counter. The night fighters that helped create that reality remained in service for years after the war ended. The lessons learned in the Pacific influenced military aviation for generations. The principle that air superiority must extend around the clock became foundational to American military doctrine. Every major conflict since World War II has featured night operations as a critical component of air warfare, a direct legacy of the transformation that occurred between 1942 and 1945. The Japanese military, rebuilt after the war under very different circumstances, absorbed those lessons as well. Post-war Japanese self-defense forces emphasized technological parity with potential adversaries, recognizing that the technological gap of World War II had been decisive. Modern Japanese air defense forces operate sophisticated radar networks and all-weather interceptors specifically designed to contest airspace control day and night, a direct response to the catastrophic failure of World War II night defenses. The human cost of this transformation was measured in tens of thousands of lives. American night fighter pilots died in training accidents and combat operations. Japanese aircrew perished in unequal fights against superior technology and training. Japanese civilians burned in firebombing raids that Japanese night defenses could not prevent. The strategic necessity that drove these operations was undeniable. But the individual tragedies, the young men who died in darkness thousands of feet above the Pacific, the families burned alive in their homes, remain the true cost of the technological and tactical revolution that reversed nocturnal supremacy. Werner Gruner, the German engineer who designed the Milligram 42 machine gun, died in Dresden in 1995, having contributed to manufacturing technology that influenced weapons development for generations. His creation changed how wars are fought through innovation in production methods rather than combat tactics. The night fighter transformation that occurred in the Pacific was different but equally profound. It changed how wars are fought through the integration of new technology, radar, into existing platforms, aircraft, creating capabilities that had not previously existed. Both transformations demonstrated that warfare evolves not through gradual improvement but through revolutionary changes that render previous advantages obsolete. The German machine gunner at Omaha Beach who fired thousands of rounds from his Milligram 42 relied on rate of fire to suppress enemy soldiers. The American night fighter pilot hunting Japanese aircraft over the Pacific relied on radar to detect targets invisible to the human eye. Both represented technological leaps that fundamentally altered combat. The irony for Japanese forces was especially bitter. They had pioneered night warfare in the Pacific. They had built doctrine, tactics, and training around nighttime superiority. They had inflicted terrible losses on American forces during night engagements in the war's early years. And then technology erased their advantage completely. The night that had been their ally became their enemy. The darkness that had protected them became the space where American technological superiority was most pronounced. Looking back from the perspective of 80 years, the transformation seems inevitable. Radar technology was improving rapidly throughout the war. American industrial capacity could produce sophisticated equipment in quantities Japan could not match. American training programs could prepare pilots for night operations at a scale impossible for fuel-starved Japanese forces by 1945. The reversal was not a matter of if but when. But to the soldiers and civilians experiencing it in real time, nothing about the transformation felt inevitable. Japanese forces that had dominated night combat in 1942 could not have predicted that within 3 years they would lose all ability to contest American night operations. American Marines cowering in foxholes at Guadalcanal during Japanese harassment raids could not have imagined that by 1945, American night fighters would patrol Japanese skies with such dominance that Japanese aircraft largely stopped flying after dark. The speed of the reversal makes it remarkable. In approximately 30 months, from mid-1942 to late 1944, American forces went from being terrorized by Japanese night operations to achieving nearly complete nocturnal air superiority. The transformation required technological innovation, tactical development, and institutional commitment to night fighting as a priority. But once accomplished, it was decisive. This is what made American night fighters more feared by Japanese soldiers than daylight raids. Daylight attacks, though devastating, could be anticipated, prepared for, sometimes even contested. Japanese fighters could intercept American bombers during the day, even if the odds were against them. Anti-aircraft guns could see their targets and engage them. Civilians could take shelter and hope to survive. Night attacks offered no such possibilities. They came without warning from an enemy that could see in the dark while Japanese defenders were blind. They struck with precision guided by radar that Japanese forces could not detect or jam effectively. They continued relentlessly, night after night, wearing down defenders who could neither stop them nor escape them. The psychological weight was crushing. Fear, in the end, was the point. Military operations are not just about destroying enemy capabilities. They are about breaking enemy will. The American Night Fighter campaign, combined with the firebombing offensive, achieved both. It destroyed Japanese Air Force's ability to contest American air superiority. And it broke the spirit of Japanese soldiers and civilians who understood that they were facing an enemy against whom they had no effective defense, an enemy who could strike at will, day or night, without meaningful resistance. The Japanese soldiers who feared American night fighters more than daylight raids understood something that statistics alone could not capture. Daylight operations, however destructive, operated within parameters that made some sense. Aircraft came from known directions. They could be seen, tracked, sometimes engaged. There was a logic to the combat, a framework within which Japanese forces could at least understand what was happening even if they could not prevent it. Night operations shattered that framework. Enemy aircraft appeared from the darkness without warning. They struck from positions Japanese defenders could not locate. They disappeared before effective response was possible. They operated with a technological advantage so overwhelming that Japanese forces had essentially no counter. The fear came from helplessness, from facing an enemy that could see when you were blind, that could strike when you were vulnerable, that could kill without ever being in danger themselves. That fear was rational. Japanese soldiers in 1945 faced American night fighters equipped with radar that could detect targets at 4 miles, directed by ground controllers using radar that extended warning ranges to 100 miles, supported by a logistics system that kept them operational continuously. Against this, Japanese forces had primitive night fighting capabilities, minimal radar coverage, fuel shortages that limited operations, and no realistic hope of gaining technological parity. The outcome was never in doubt once American night fighter capabilities matured. Japanese forces understood this. Their planning for homeland defense assumed they would face American air superiority around the clock. Their tactical doctrine acknowledged that night provided no protection from American technological advantage. Their morale reflected the knowledge that every nightfall brought renewed vulnerability to an enemy they could not meaningfully resist. This is why Japanese soldiers feared American night fighters more than daylight raids. Daylight raids could be endured, survived, perhaps even opposed. Night fighters represented something more fundamental and more terrifying: the complete loss of darkness as sanctuary, the transformation of night from ally to enemy, the realization that no time of day offered safety from an enemy whose technological superiority had rendered traditional defensive measures obsolete. If you found this exploration of a lesser-known aspect of World War II meaningful, consider subscribing to this channel. History reveals its most important lessons not just in major battles but in technological and tactical shifts that fundamentally changed how wars are fought. Understanding these transformations helps us appreciate the human cost of technological progress and the strategic decisions that shape conflicts.